liquidity ratios. We've got long-term solvency ratios. The liquidity ratios are really geared towards our working capital and helps in our working capital decisions. Liquidity, can we pay our bills on time? Then we move to the long-term solvency ratios. These have a lot to do with our capital structure, our amount of leverage, how we raise funds, how we finance our assets, are basically equity versus debt, and these ratios are telling us what proportion. Then we go to the asset turnover ratios, which we just finished. That's all about generation of revenues, and it's about how efficient we're using those assets to produce sales, which end up to be the first item on our cash flows, right? Does that make sense to everybody? All right, that brings us to measuring profitability. So profitability, we have three specifically ratios that we're going to talk about. The first one is the profit margin. And profit margin, as you can see here, defined just as our net income, or maybe you might see it as earnings. This is after tax, all right? So these are net income after tax divided by sales. All right, that's a percentage, and this percentage, we pulled off of our income statement. You would see that net income was $689,000. Then we had sales of $5,000. All right, we get a profit margin that's equal to almost 14%. All right, and so is that high? Is that low? Should this number be high, or should we like it to be low? What?
Yeah. Profit margin.
I think profit margins are good, right? Have you all been watching Shark Tank?
Yeah.
Okay. So Shark Tank is a great one, and they're looking for margin. And one of them, there's a number of different profit margins. This one's net profit margin. Sometimes it's just called the profit margin. It's kind of the granddaddy of them all. But you'd actually do margins on gross profits. Gross basically is looking at the margin of your sales that are going towards raw materials, basically, all right? This one has everything taken out, taxes included, all the way down to taxes. And so the greater the profit margin, the better. So on Shark Tank, if you can show that your margins are good, they really like you. And they'll say, oh, and that's basically when you're telling them how much can you produce this thing you're trying to sell them. I can produce it for $1, I can sell it for $10, and they're going to go, ooh, wow, right? Does that make sense to everybody? And what they're talking about right there is probably their gross margin. That's what I get from it. That's just their cost of goods taken out. This one's profit margin, because you've got taxes out, you've got interest out. A lot of those guys on Shark, though, don't have any loans, so there is no interest. That's why they're going on Shark Tank, is to get an investor, because they can't get banks to invest in them. Trying to find some angel investors, and that's what those Shark Tank guys are, right? So there is no liabilities on their balance sheet typically at all. They just have to basically be paying their employees, keep the lights turned on, but they don't have any debt typically. That's usually the case. All right, does that make sense to everyone? All right, so the higher, the better. I also want to make this point, which this is not necessarily intuitive. Profit margin is a measure of cost control, all right? A lot of people think, oh, no, it's not. It's both cost control and revenue maximization at the same time. Because isn't profit revenues minus costs? So on the surface, it would seem like net income is telling you about both sides of this. But when you put it in margin form, all right, in margin form, I'm going to take this profit margin, which I'm going to call it PM, is equal to net income over sales, which net income is equal to sales minus cost of goods, minus depreciation, minus interest, minus tax. We're going to take all that and divide it by sales. Do a little bit of algebra. We can take sales over sales, minus cost of goods over sales, minus depreciation over sales, minus interest over sales, minus tax over sales. I thought my dude was better. I thought I had a new one. All right, notice this guy falls out to 1, right? And all of a sudden, this profit margin is about a bunch of costs.
Yeah.
And it's the percentage of the cost relative to your sales.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to everyone? So how do you get a bigger profit margin? It's basically reducing, because these are minus signs, reducing any one of those costs. Does that make sense to everyone? Get a bigger profit margin by reduction of cost control. So when you're looking at the profit margin, it really, when you drive down to its true meaning, it's all about cost control. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Whereas on that previous slide about asset utilization or the total asset turnover, that's about the revenue generation. That's really getting at the revenue generation. This is about cost control. So we've got both sides of that idea of profitability, but it's broken up into 2 different kind of ratio sets. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about return on assets. And so, like I taught you, return is always in the numerator. The investment to get that return is in the denominator. And our ROA is the first one we're going to take, is our return in the numerator, which is net income, right? And in the denominator, what do you think our investment to get that return should be? Assets, total assets. So it's these assets that we purchase that produce this benefit. So this is our investment, are our assets, and our net income is our benefit. Now I'm going to write this a little bit differently. You won't see this on the test, but I just want to show some intuition here to you. Assets are the same thing as liabilities plus equity. That's our investment, right? Here is our net income. Does that make sense to everyone? So here's our investment of credit, our investment of equity. So we've got our creditors' investment, we've got our shareholders' investment. That kind of sometimes solidifies to you what the investment is in that denominator, and the net income is our benefit from that investment, right? So our return on assets, as you can see, net income over total assets is the easiest way to compute that. Net income on our income statement was $689. Our total assets are $53.94. We find a number of 12.77. There is no number too high. That number can't be high. I mean, higher the better. All right, the higher the better. That means the more benefit we're getting from our investment into both our credit investment as well as our equity investment. Make sense to everybody? No number too high. All right, and this is just basically think of it as our total investment from both sets of investors, creditors and equity holders. All right. Now the next one is return on equity. And return on equity, again, numerator is our benefit, that's net income. Denominator is our investment. We're looking at the return to the equity holders. We're now taking out those creditors. We want to know the shareholders' return. Shareholders' return, that means that the shareholders, the equity is in our denominator. That's the investment. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
All right. Plug into the equation. Our 689 appears again. That's our net income. Our equity is 2556. As you would expect, this return on equity is much larger than the return on assets. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Because you're taking out a big group of creditors in the denominator. You're making that denominator smaller.
Yeah.
And so your net income stays the same at 689, but you're removing a big set of those investors, those creditors, and leaving only the equity holders in the denominator, and that number, of course, is pop up. And it pops up by close to double, right? What was our ratio of debt to equity?
It was half, it was almost half.
It was
like
about
55.
half, yeah, it was $1.11 of debt to $1 even of equity. So it was close to half, right? About 53% of our assets were levered, 47% were being financed with money out of our own pocket equity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're taking basically half of your investment out here, and when you do that, look what happens to that number. You're doubling it. Does that make sense to everyone? Does the numbers start to kind of